The satellite phone crackled at 2:47 a.m., dragging Dr. Marcus Webb from a dream of sterile conference rooms and tenure committees into the frigid reality of his field station in Washington's Cascade Range. November rain hammered the corrugated roof of the research cabin, a relentless percussion that had been his lullaby for 3 months of black bear population surveys. "Webb here." His voice was gravel and exhaustion. "Marcus, it's Sarah Koenig. We have a situation at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center in Packwood. I need you here, now." Sarah ran the Gifford Pinchot Wildlife Corridor Project, a woman whose professional composure Marcus had never seen crack in 15 years. Tonight, her voice carried something he'd never heard before, fear wrapped in wonder. "Sarah, it's 3 in the morning, and I'm 40 miles from Marcus. I have an ape, a great ape, in Washington State. It's injured, it's massive, and it doesn't match anything in any taxonomy I know." The line went silent except for the static of rain and distance. "I need a primatologist, and I need discretion. You're the only person within 200 miles who fits both requirements." Marcus was pulling on field clothes before he consciously decided to go. His hands moved with the autonomy of professional conditioning. Thermal layer, waterproof shell, emergency medical kit, digital recorder, specimen collection supplies. The scientific method had trained him for implausibility. When data contradicted expectations, you investigated the data. The drive down Forest Road 25 was a white-knuckle exercise in controlled skidding. His truck's headlights carved tunnels through darkness and deluge, illuminating Douglas firs that towered like the pillars of some vast, drowned cathedral. The Olympic Biodiversity Research Station maintained the rehabilitation center as a satellite facility, technically illegal for anything beyond state-licensed wildlife, but also remote enough that questions were rarely asked. Sarah had always operated in the gray zones where conservation met bureaucracy. The center was a cluster of modular buildings surrounded by chain link and razor wire, more fortress than veterinary clinic. Marcus found Sarah in the largest structure, a climate-controlled examination room that smelled of antiseptic and something else, something organic and ancient that didn't belong in a sterile space. She met him at the door, her face haggard in the fluorescent glare. "Before you see it," she said, gripping his arm with surprising strength, "I need you to understand what I'm asking. This doesn't get reported. Not to fish and wildlife, not to your university, not to anyone. If this becomes public knowledge, this creature's existence becomes a circus, and its species, if there is a species, gets hunted to extinction or locked in laboratories. Do you understand?" Marcus understood protocol violations. He understood career suicide. He also understood that Sarah Koenig wouldn't destroy both their professional lives for a black bear with unusual markings. "Show me," he said. The examination room's far end had been converted into a secure observation area, reinforced plexiglass, double-locked entry, temperature monitors. Beyond the transparent barrier, under banks of warm surgical lights, lay something that made Marcus's breath stop. It was massive, 7.5 feet if it stood, Sarah whispered, maybe 450 pounds. The body was covered in dark auburn hair, matted now with mud and dried blood, densest across the shoulders and back, sparser on the face and palms. The facial structure hit Marcus like a theoretical physics equation that suddenly resolved. Pronounced supraorbital ridge, broad flat nose, prognathous jaw, but the overall architecture was eerily, impossibly human. The creature lay on its side, breathing shallowly. Its right leg splintered and bandaged. An IV line fed into its left arm, not foreleg, the distinction was critical, delivering saline and broad-spectrum antibiotics. "Talk to me," Marcus managed, his voice barely functional. "Logging truck hit it 2 nights ago on Highway 12, 20 miles east of here. Driver thought he'd struck a hiker in a costume, called 911. By the time emergency services arrived, the victim was gone, crawled into the tree line, despite what we now know is a compound femoral fracture. Forest Service found a blood trail, called me because they thought it might be a bear. We tracked it 18 hours before we got a tranquilizer dart into it. Sarah pulled up images on her tablet, tracks in mud, each print 17 inches long with a clearly separated hallux, an opposable big toe. Marcus moved closer to the glass. The creature's eyes were closed, but he could see the fine structure of its face, individual pores, the subtle mobility of flesh over skull, the faint shimmer of awareness even in sedation. This was not a costume. This was not a hoax. Every instinct built through 20 years of comparative anatomy was screaming that he was looking at a living organism, something that breathed and bled and metabolized. "Genetic samples?" he asked. "Blood, hair, saliva. I've kept them refrigerated, but I haven't sent anything to a lab. I need to know what we're dealing with before I document a chain of custody that creates legal obligations." Sarah's hand shook slightly as she zoomed in on X-rays displayed on a wall monitor. "Look at the skeletal structure. The bone density is massive, adapted for bipedal locomotion. The skull capacity is at least 1,400 cubic centimeters. Marcus, that's within human range." He stared at the X-rays. Femur, tibia, fibula. The complex architecture of foot bones configured for upright walking. The spine showed the S-curve of bipedalism, the foramen magnum positioned beneath the skull rather than behind it. The hands, 5 digits, opposable thumbs, delicate phalanges capable of precision grip. "Have you done a karyotype?" His mind was already racing through protocols, cellular analysis, chromosome counts. "No equipment here. But Marcus, its blood type is O positive. Human O positive." The words hung in the air like sediment that refused to settle. Blood typing was crude but reliable taxonomy. O positive meant antigens, meant immune system architecture that echoed Homo sapiens at a molecular level. It meant relationship, kinship, a divergence point somewhere in evolutionary history. "It woke up once," Sarah continued, her voice dropping. "4 hours after we stabilized it, before we could resedate. It looked at me. Not the way an animal looks at you, assessing threat, calculating escape. It looked at me, recognition, cognition. Then it reached out, slowly, and touched the IV bag. Ran its fingers over the plastic. Curious, investigative. She met his eyes. Marcus, it understood it was receiving treatment. Protocol said to contact the Smithsonian, the National Institutes of Health, every major research institution with primate expertise. Protocol said to document, to establish peer review, to subject findings to the crucible of scientific scrutiny. But protocol also led to media storms, to specimen acquisition, to dissection tables and captive research populations. Marcus thought of Jane Goodall, watching chimps at Gombe, slowly earning trust over months and years. He thought of Diane Fossey, murdered for protecting mountain gorillas from poachers and politics. He thought of every indigenous people photographed, studied, catalogued, their existence transformed into data while their autonomy dissolved. "What's your assessment of recovery?" he asked, choosing a path even as he spoke. "The fracture was clean. I've set it with biodegradable pins, but it'll need 8 to 12 weeks of minimal weight bearing. In a hospital with a human patient, we'd be looking at physical therapy, controlled rehabilitation. Here," she gestured at the reinforced room, "we have a cage, essentially, and a decision." The creature shifted slightly, a small vocalization escaping its throat, low, rumbling, almost subsonic. The sound resonated in Marcus's chest, bypassed language, communicated distress at a level that predated words. "Can we keep it sedated continuously for 3 months?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "Not without organ damage, and sedation prevents healing. It needs to be conscious, needs to move the limb carefully, needs to engage its metabolism." Sarah pulled up more data. "I've been monitoring brain activity with a portable EEG. Alpha and beta waves consistent with higher cognition. During its brief conscious period, I saw patterns that looked like problem-solving, active thought. Marcus, if this is a sentient being, keeping it chemically restrained might constitute—" She didn't finish the sentence. "Torture," Marcus completed. "Or at minimum, false imprisonment." They stood in silence, the weight of implications settling like snow. Outside, the November rain continued its assault, the Pacific Northwest drowning under autumn's deluge. This creature had evolved here, in these mountains, surviving in the spaces between human observation. How many were there? A population needed genetic diversity, at least 50 to 100 breeding individuals to maintain viability. How had they remained hidden? The answer came as Marcus studied the being's features more carefully, morphological adaptations for stealth. The hair pattern would break up silhouette in forest shadow. The foot structure, that separated hallux, would allow for climbing, for arboreal escape routes that ground-based trackers couldn't follow. The muscle density suggested power and endurance, the ability to cover vast territories quickly to avoid human corridors. And the cranial capacity suggested intelligence, the ability to learn, to teach young, to transmit culture and avoidance strategies across generations. "We need to wake it up," Marcus said finally. "We need to assess cognitive function, establish whether it's capable of understanding its situation. If it demonstrates sapience, true self-awareness, capacity for symbolic thought, then we're not dealing with wildlife management. We're dealing with a person." Sarah nodded slowly. "I was hoping you'd say that. I was also terrified you'd say that. There's no ethical framework for this," Marcus continued, his mind cataloguing the absence of guidelines. "Do we apply Belmont Report principles? Informed consent, beneficence, justice? How do you obtain informed consent from a being with no shared language?" "There's a researcher at Central Washington University," Sarah offered. "Dr. Patricia Alvarez. She works with great ape cognition and sign language. If anyone could develop a communication protocol, another person knowing multiplies our exposure," Marcus interrupted, then caught himself. This was how cover-ups began, in the name of protection. "But you're right. We need expertise we don't have. Can you trust her?" "With my career, I'm about to find out." They spent the next hour collecting samples, with the creature still unconscious. Hair from different body regions, carefully extracted blood for eventual DNA sequencing, photographs from every angle with a high-resolution medical camera. Marcus took measurements with calipers and soft tape, cranial dimensions, limb ratios, the extraordinary width of the zygomatic arch that would anchor massive temporalis muscles for a powerful bite. The hands fascinated him, scarred, calloused, with wear patterns that suggested tool use. He photographed the palms in detail. The dermal ridges were clearly visible, whorls and loops that looked eerily like fingerprints. At 6:15 a.m., they reduced sedation incrementally, monitoring vitals, ready with emergency tranquilizer. The creature's breathing shifted, became less regular, more responsive. Its fingers twitched. Then its eyes opened. They were dark hazel, flecked with amber, and utterly, devastatingly aware. The gaze swept the room, taking in the IV stand, the monitoring equipment, the observation window where Marcus and Sarah stood frozen. There was no panic, no thrashing. Instead, a methodical assessment, the visible processing of an intelligence gathering information. The creature tried to sit up, gasped. Marcus heard it clearly, a distinctly human sound of pain, and looked down at its splintered leg. One hand moved carefully to touch the bandaging, fingers exploring the texture of medical gauze with obvious curiosity. Then the gaze lifted again, found Marcus through the glass, and held. For 17 seconds, Marcus Webb stared into the eyes of something that shouldn't exist and saw recognition. Not of him specifically, but of situation, of context. The creature understood it was injured. It understood it was receiving care. And in the slight tilt of its head, the minute relaxation of its shoulders, Marcus saw something that made his throat constrict. Trust, or perhaps the tentative decision to trust. Slowly, So slowly, the creature raised one hand, held it palm forward, fingers spread. The gesture was so human, so universal, I mean no harm, that Marcus found himself mirroring it, his own hand rising to press against the cool plexiglass. The creature's eyes widened fractionally. Its lips parted, thick, mobile lips capable of complex sounds, and it made a low vocalization, almost interrogative. "Who are you?" the tone seemed to ask. "What happens now?" Marcus didn't have answers. But standing there, his palm separated from another sentient being by 3/4 of an inch of transparent polymer, he made a choice that would define the rest of his life. "We're going to help you," he said aloud, knowing the words meant nothing yet, but needing to speak them. "We're going to learn how to talk to each other, and then you're going to tell me what you need." The creature's head tilted further, a gesture so utterly familiar that Marcus had to blink back sudden moisture in his eyes. It didn't understand the words, but it understood that words were being spoken to it with intention, with the presumption of comprehension. Sarah was already on her phone texting, "Pat, I need you. Emergency consultation. Non-disclosable. Trust me on this." As the reply came in 90 seconds. Address. As dawn broke over the Cascades, washing the rehabilitation center in weak November light, Marcus sat down against the wall opposite the observation window and opened his laptop. He began typing field notes, knowing already that they would never be published, never be cited, never contribute to his academic record. Day 1. Hour 0. First conscious contact with unidentified hominin. Specimen presents with anatomical features consistent with bipedal locomotion, cranial capacity within human range, and clear evidence of higher cognitive function. Preliminary assessment, sapient. Recommend communication protocol development as highest priority. Ethical status, unclear. Legal status, undefined. Moral obligation, absolute. Through the plexiglass, the creature watched him type, its gaze following the movement of his fingers across the keyboard with unmistakable interest. It was learning already, Marcus realized. Observing, cataloging, beginning the work of understanding. They were going to understand each other. They had to. Because before this being could heal and return to whatever life it had known, Marcus needed to learn what Sarah had glimpsed in those first moments of consciousness. He needed to know what it meant when a hidden people's last representative looked at you with hope. Dr. Patricia Alvarez arrived 90 minutes later in a mud-splattered Subaru, her silver-streaked hair pulled into a hasty bun, her expression oscillating between skepticism and barely contained excitement. Sarah met her at the entrance, their conversation a low, urgent exchange that Marcus couldn't hear through the reinforced walls, but could read in Pat's body language. Incredulity, resistance, then a sudden stiffening of her spine as she processed whatever evidence Sarah was providing. When they entered the observation room, Pat stopped 3 feet from the plexiglass barrier, her coffee cup forgotten in her hand, her mouth working soundlessly. The creature, Marcus had mentally begun calling it the individual, rejecting the clinical distance of specimen, sat upright against the far wall, its injured leg extended, its dark, hazel eyes tracking the new arrival with calm attention. "Mother of God," Pat whispered. "Sarah, what have you done?" "Saved a life," Sarah replied evenly. "Now I need you to help us communicate with it. Them. Him." She faltered over pronouns, the absence of linguistic infrastructure suddenly glaring. Pat moved closer, her scientific training reasserting itself, years of behavioral observation clicking into place. Marcus watched her scan the individual's posture, facial expression, the placement of hands, one resting on its good knee, the other near the IV insertion site, protective but not pulling at the line. "It's not displaying threat behavior," Pat murmured, more to herself than to them. "No bared teeth, no piloerection, no averting gaze. It's watching me, assessing." She pulled out her phone, began recording. "I need to document baseline behavior before we attempt any interaction protocol." For the next hour, the three scientists observed, while the individual observed them back. It was a strange, silent negotiation of mutual curiosity. The individual periodically examined its surroundings: the IV bag, the monitoring cables, the fluorescent lights overhead, with a methodical attention that spoke of intelligence trying to construct a mental model of unfamiliar technology. At one point, it picked up a small plastic cup that had been left in the room, turned it over in its large hands, tested its flexibility, set it down again. The sequence of actions was unmistakably investigative, experimental. Tool manipulation, Pat said softly. Fine motor control, sequential problem-solving behavior. Marcus, this is great ape cognition, but the cranial structure, the bipedalism, what's the genetic data? We don't have sequencing yet, Marcus admitted. Only blood typing, which came back human-compatible. I've preserved samples for full genomic analysis, but we're operating in a documentation vacuum. This can't go to a commercial lab without triggering biohazard and ethical review protocols. I have a contact at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center, Pat offered. Gene therapy researcher, very discreet. If I frame it as unidentified primate DNA, request anonymous sequencing, she was already calculating, her mind racing through networks of trust and favors owed. Sarah checked the monitors. Vitals are stable. Pain indicators are elevated but manageable. We're going to need to do wound care and change the dressing in about 6 hours. That's going to require either sedation or, she looked at Pat, or cooperation. Cooperation requires communication, Pat said, her voice taking on the cadence of a lecture she'd given hundreds of times. Non-verbal initially, we establish basic signs for essential concepts: food, water, pain, yes, no. We use operant conditioning principles, but we're respectful of agency. This isn't training. It's mutual language learning. She paused, her expression turning inward. But there's an ethical minefield here. The moment we teach it to communicate with us, we're establishing a relationship that creates obligations. We can't just release it and pretend this never happened. We become responsible for its welfare, its choices, its future. As opposed to what? Marcus challenged. Keeping it sedated until it heals, then dumping it in the forest with no understanding of what happened to it. That's more ethical. Pat raised her hands in surrender. I'm not disagreeing. I'm pointing out that we're committing to something enormous. If this individual learns to communicate, and if it tells us things we can't ignore, about others of its kind, about threats to their survival, about needs we might not be equipped to meet, what then? The question hung in the sterile air, like a toxin. Through the plexiglass, the individual shifted position carefully, keeping weight off its injured leg, and made a low vocalization, a rumble that started in its chest and modulated upward, almost interrogative. The sound was not quite human, not quite animal, something from a phonological space that didn't exist in any language Marcus knew. It's asking a question, Pat said with certainty, or expressing need. We need to respond, even if it can't understand us yet. We need to establish that communication is reciprocal. She approached the plexiglass, positioned herself to be clearly visible, and made a simple, deliberate gesture, hand to mouth, mimicking drinking. Then she pointed to a water bottle on a shelf inside the secured area, repeated the gesture. The individual watched intently, eyes tracking the movement, then followed the pointing finger to the water bottle. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the individual raised one hand, made a motion that approximated Pat's gesture, less fluid, the fingers slightly different in configuration, but clearly imitative. It was trying to copy her. "Yes," Pat breathed. "Marcus, get a notepad. We're going to document every gesture, every response. This is first contact, and we're going to do it right." Over the next 3 hours, they established a rudimentary protocol. Pat would make a sign, ASL-based but simplified, and if the individual responded appropriately, Sarah would provide the corresponding item through a small pass-through portal. Water, an apple, a soft cloth. The individual caught on with astonishing speed. By the 30th exchange, it was initiating requests, making the sign for water without prompting. By the 40th, it had created its own gesture, a hand pressed flat to its abdomen, that clearly meant hunger. "It's not just learning," Pat said, her voice tight with wonder. "It's innovating. It's generating novel signs based on conceptual understanding. Do you know what that means? That's syntax. That's symbolic thought." Marcus was documenting everything, his hands cramping from rapid notation. The individual had a remarkable capacity for focus, maintaining attention on the communication exercises, even though it must have been in considerable pain. Periodically it would touch its splinted leg, make a soft grunt of discomfort, but it always returned to the interaction, as if understanding that this was important, that this exchange of meaning was the key to whatever came next. At 2 p.m., Sarah gently insisted on a break. "It's been conscious for 8 hours. It needs rest, and honestly, so do we. Pat, can you stay? We've got a spare cot in the back office." Pat laughed, a slightly hysterical edge to the sound. "Stay? Sarah, I'm not leaving this building until I understand what I'm looking at. I've just spent the morning teaching sign language to a cryptid. My entire career has been preparation for this moment, and I didn't even know it." They rotated through shifts, 2 observing while 1 rested. Marcus found himself studying the individual during quiet periods, noting details. The hair pattern was thicker on the shoulders and upper back, creating a cape-like effect that would shed rain efficiently. The hands, now that he could observe them in action, showed callousing consistent with frequent climbing, thick pads on the palm, scarring on the knuckles. The feet, visible when the individual adjusted position, had that distinctive separated hallux, the big toe extending laterally almost like a thumb. It was an anatomy built for arboreal navigation, for grasping branches, for a 3-dimensional forest world. Who had this individual been before the logging truck? What had it been doing on a highway at night? Was it young or old? Pat estimated middle-aged based on tooth wear, visible when it ate an apple, the enamel showing decades of use, but not elderly degradation. Did it have family, a mate, offspring waiting somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Cascades? On day 2, they attempted more complex communication. Pat introduced signs for help, hurt, hear, tapping the floor, and later, a sweeping motion forward. The individual absorbed them with that same eerie quickness, but Marcus noticed something else: frustration. When the individual tried to communicate something more complex, a series of gestures that combined later and here, and a pointing motion toward the exterior wall, and they couldn't understand, its shoulders slumped. It made a low sound, almost mournful, and turned away. "It's trying to tell us something," Marcus said quietly. "Something we don't have the vocabulary for yet." Pat bit her lip. "We need more signs. We need concepts for outside, for other, for—" She paused, then looked at Marcus. "For family, for others like me, because that's what it's trying to say, isn't it? That there are others." Sarah checked the monitors, her face drawn. "If there are others, and if they saw or heard the accident, they might be looking. We're 20 miles from the impact site. If this species has any kind of social structure, any kind of cohesion, they could be searching." The implications were staggering. A search would mean tracks, sightings, potentially exposure. But more than that, it meant that somewhere in the November wilderness, others might be grieving, might be desperate. "We need to teach it later and wait," Marcus said decisively. "We need to communicate that it can't travel now, that healing takes time." And then he looked at the individual, who had turned back to watch them, eyes bright with hope and desperation. "Then we need to figure out how to reunite it with its people." The genomic data arrived on day 5, delivered by an encrypted email from Pat's contact, Dr. Chen. The subject line read simply, "What the hell is this?" Marcus opened the attachment with hands that wanted to shake, scanned the summary, felt the world tilt. Pat and Sarah crowded around his laptop, reading over his shoulder. Closest match, Homo sapiens, 98.7% genomic similarity, divergence estimate, 500,000, 750,000 years before present. Key differences, insertions in genes associated with cold adaptation, muscle density, reduced metabolic rate. Notable archaic allele variants consistent with Denisovan Neanderthal introgression patterns. Assessment, unidentified hominin species, sister clade to modern humans. Recommend immediate peer review and taxonomic classification. 500,000 years, Sarah whispered. They've been here, evolving parallel to us for 500,000 years. Not parallel, Pat corrected. Look at the introgression note. At some point, our lineages interbred. We shared genetic material. There was contact, mixing. They're not just relatives, they're cousins. Very, very close cousins. Marcus felt the weight of it, the staggering implication. This wasn't an animal. This was a person, in the most fundamental biological sense. A human cousin who had chosen, or been forced by, historical circumstance to live hidden, to survive in the margins, while Homo sapiens came to dominate the planet. He thought of all the indigenous peoples displaced by colonization, driven to extinction or assimilation. He thought of the last speakers of dying languages, the erosion of cultures that couldn't compete with technological civilizations. And he thought about what happened when the hidden became visible, when refugee became exposure. "We can't release this data," he said finally. "Not yet. Not until we understand what this population needs to survive." "Agreed," Pat said. "But Marcus, we have a larger problem. It's been 6 days. The individual is healing well, but it's also becoming increasingly distressed. Watch." She pointed to the monitor showing real-time video feed. The individual sat against the wall, methodically signing the same sequence over and over. "Others, outside. Wait. Others, outside. Wait." The repetition was obsessive, desperate. "It's not asking if there are others," Pat continued. "It's telling us there are others, and that they're waiting. It thinks we're keeping it from its family." Marcus felt a cold clarity settle over him. "Then we need to tell it the truth. We need to explain that it was injured, that it needs more time to heal, and that we don't know how to find its people. We need vocabulary for concepts we haven't taught yet." Over the next 2 days, they expanded the lexicon furiously. Broken for the injury, time, a circular motion, many days, strong, flexing an arm, not strong, limp arm, look for, hand shading eyes, don't know, palms up, shaking head. Each sign had to be taught, practiced, confirmed. And the individual learned them all, its intelligence evident in how quickly it grasped not just the signs, but the abstract concepts they represented. On day 9, Pat attempted the crucial conversation. She used the full vocabulary they'd built. You, broken, here, many days, you, strong, later, others. Then she signed look for and don't know, the admission of limitation. The individual stared at her, processing. Then it stood, carefully favoring its healing leg, and approached the plexiglass. It was the closest it had been to them, near enough that Marcus could see the fine structure of its face, the way its breath fogged the transparent barrier. It began to sign, slowly and deliberately, others, many, forest. Then a gesture they hadn't taught, a sweeping motion that seemed to indicate vast distance or large numbers. Me, important. Another unknown sign, a hand to its chest, then outward, protective. Others, safe. It tapped its chest. Me, here. Others, not safe. The message was stunningly clear. This individual wasn't just worried about being separated. It believed its presence here endangered the others. It was somehow important to their safety. A leader, a knowledge keeper, someone whose absence created vulnerability. "Oh, God," Sarah breathed. It thinks we're a threat. It thinks by keeping it, we've discovered its people. The individual continued signing, more urgently now. Me. Go. Later. Others. Find. Me. Others. Find. You. The signs for find and you were sharp, almost accusatory. Others, not safe. You. It's protecting them, Marcus said, the full picture coming into terrible focus. It wants to leave not just to reunite, but to lead us away. It thinks if it's released, it can draw any human attention away from wherever the main population is. He looked at the individual, saw the intelligence in those hazel eyes, the strategic thinking. It's willing to sacrifice its own safety to protect the group. Pat made a decision. She positioned herself directly in front of the plexiglass, established eye contact, and signed with slow emphasis. You, safe. Others, safe. We, help. Then she repeated, help, made it as clear as possible. We, not harm. We, help. The individual watched her, head tilted in that now familiar expression of careful assessment. Then it made a sign they'd taught early. True? True, Pat signed back, nodding vigorously. True. A long pause. Then the individual sank back down against the wall, its massive shoulders slumping, and for the first time it closed its eyes while they were in the room. It was, Marcus realized with a jolt, a display of trust. It was choosing to be vulnerable in their presence. We need a plan, Sarah said quietly. A real plan. Because in 3 weeks, maybe 4, that leg will be healed enough for travel. And when that happens, we need to have answers. How do we release it safely? How do we ensure we don't inadvertently expose its population? And, she paused, the weight of the unspoken question heavy in the room. What if it asks for something we can't give? Marcus didn't have answers. But he had a growing certainty that they were approaching a threshold. A moment where communication would reveal needs that transcended band-aids and antibiotics. On day 12, the individual created its first representational art. They'd given it paper and a charcoal pencil, partly to combat boredom, partly to assess fine motor control as the leg healed. The individual had examined the materials with the now familiar intense curiosity, experimented with making marks, figured out through trial that pressure-modulated line darkness. What it drew made Marcus's breath catch. The sketch was crude but unmistakable. Figures, many of them, with the characteristic broad-shouldered conical head silhouette of the individual species. They were arranged in a group, some sitting, some standing. In the center, larger and more detailed, was one figure with a marking on its chest, a series of lines that might have been scarring or body paint. Near this central figure, smaller sketches, a circle with radiating lines, the sun, a series of wavy horizontal lines, water, mountains, and symbols that looked almost like pictographs, geometric shapes that might have been a writing system or clan markers. The individual pointed to the central figure, then to itself. Me, it signed. Then it pointed to the other figures, signed others, family. Then it made a gesture they'd taught, one finger extended, rotating in a circle. Many, many, many. It wasn't just showing them there were others. It was showing them social structure, hierarchy, belonging, and the central position of its own figure suggested importance, leadership certainly, or perhaps specialized knowledge. Pat photographed the drawing, her hands unsteady. This is material culture. This is symbolic representation of social organization. This is... She couldn't finish. The individual wasn't done. It started a second drawing, the same group, but one figure separated, alone. It pointed to this isolated figure, marked with the same chest symbols, signed me. Then it drew a jagged line bisecting the paper, pointed to one side, signed others, pointed to the other side, signed you, here. The message was clear. The separation was categorical, spatial. The others were on one side of a boundary. The individual, and by extension the humans, were on the other, and the distance between them was more than geographic. It's drawing a map, Marcus said slowly, a conceptual map of separation. It's trying to make us understand the territory, the barrier between worlds. The individual set down the charcoal, looked directly at Marcus through the plexiglass, and signed something that made his heart sink. Others need me. Then a sign they'd taught for physical requirements. Need many things. A pause, and then a new combination, inventive and heartbreaking. Need, not broken. It was telling them that the others needed it to be whole, to be functional, that its value to the community was contingent on its ability, physical or otherwise, to fulfill some role. "What do you need?" Pat signed, though they didn't yet have vocabulary for complex, abstract concepts. "Tell us. What do you need?" The individual picked up the charcoal again. This time it drew something different, a figure itself, and a small, simplified sketch of a building. Clearly this facility, recognizable by the rectangular shape and small windows. Then it drew an arrow from itself to the structure, and from the structure to the group of figures representing its people. But the arrow stopped midway, broken, discontinuous. It tapped the broken arrow, signed "not work," then looked at them with an expression that transcended species, an expression of profound sorrow. It was telling them that the connection couldn't be restored, that returning wasn't possible or wasn't safe or wouldn't accomplish what needed to be accomplished. Then it drew one more element, a small figure separate from the main group, marked with different symbols. It pointed to this figure, then made a complex series of signs. Young, not strong, broken. It pointed to its own leg, the universal sign for injury they'd established. Then it tapped the small figure insistently, signed "need help, need, not broken." Understanding crashed over Marcus like a physical force. The individual wasn't just telling them about its people, it was telling them about a specific individual, young, injured, vulnerable, and it was asking for something impossible, to extend the help they'd given to it, to another of its kind, to somehow bridge the unbridgeable gap between worlds and provide medical intervention to a population that couldn't afford to be discovered. "There's a young one that's hurt," Sarah whispered, "and it wants us to help. But to help, we'd have to make contact with the others. We'd have to expose them. We'd have to—" She trailed off, the impossibility of it crushing. The individual watched them process, its eyes moving from face to face, reading their expressions with that uncanny perceptiveness. Then it signed, with careful precision, "You help me." It gestured to its healing leg, to the IV line that had been removed 2 days ago, to the room that had kept it safe. "You help others?" The sign for others was emphatic, pleading. Then it added a new sign, one it created in that moment, hand over its heart, then extending outward, palm up, an offering or a prayer. "Please," Pat translated, tears streaming down her face. "It's saying please." Marcus pressed his forehead against the cool plexiglass, feeling the weight of a species' survival resting on the answer to an impossible question. How did you help the hidden without destroying the very concealment that protected them? How did you save one without endangering all? The individual placed its hand on the barrier, mirroring the gesture Marcus had made on that first conscious morning. But now, 12 days into their shared language, the meaning was different. It wasn't just a gesture of peace. It was a request for covenant, for partnership in stewardship of the impossible. And Marcus didn't know if he could give what was being asked. The rain had finally stopped on day 15, leaving the Cascade forests dripping and silver. When Sarah's motion-triggered wildlife camera, 14 miles northeast of the facility, captured something impossible. 3 figures, massive and unmistakable, moving through a Douglas fir grove at dawn. They walked upright, deliberate, pausing periodically to examine the ground, tracking, searching. The largest of the 3 carried something across its shoulders, a rough travois made of branches, as if prepared to transport an injured individual. The image quality was poor, grainy with distance and low light, but the purposefulness was clear. They were looking for their missing member. Sarah showed the footage to Marcus in the cramped office that had become their command center, her face haggard from 2 weeks of interrupted sleep and ethical vertigo. They're getting closer. Maybe 8 miles from here now, based on the camera's location. And Marcus, look at this. She zoomed in on the largest figure. Across its chest, clearly visible even through the pixel grain, were markings, the same pattern of lines the individual had drawn on its self-representation. Not paint, Marcus realized. Scarification, permanent body modification that marked identity, maybe kinship, definitely purpose. It's the family group, he said, stating the obvious, because speaking it aloud made it manageable, made it data instead of crushing moral weight. They know somehow that it survived. They're following, what? Scent? Memory of the impact location? Pure mathematical probability? Intelligence, Pat said from the doorway, startling them both. She'd been with the individual, teaching new vocabulary, building the lexicon that let them communicate more complex ideas. She looked exhausted and exhilarated in equal measure. It told me this morning. Told me, Marcus, in constructed sentences with conditional clauses. It said its people would search in expanding spirals from the injury site, checking human structures because they've learned over generations, that humans sometimes take the injured. It said they'd look for 3 weeks, and if they found no sign, they'd assume death and perform the mourning rituals. 3 weeks, Sarah repeated. We're at 15 days. That gives us 6 days before they give up and disappear, or before they find us, Marcus countered. Sarah, if they track to this facility, what then? Do we open the doors and hope for peaceful contact? Do we try to tranquilize a group that's already terrified and desperate? There's no good outcome to an uncontrolled meeting. The individual had named itself, after a fashion, on day 13. It was a vocalization they couldn't quite reproduce, something between kran and kran, with a glottal component and a deep resonance that human vocal anatomy couldn't replicate. But it had also created a sign name, a hand tapping the chest over the heart, then sweeping outward protectively, the one who shields. Pat had interpreted it as a social role, a function within the group, guardian perhaps, or strategist. Now Kran stood against the plexiglass, listening as Pat explained the camera footage using their shared vocabulary. Marcus watched the individual's face. He'd learned to read the subtle expressions, the minute shifts that conveyed emotion, and saw first hope, then conflict, then a resolution that looked like grief. Kran signed carefully. Others. Close. Danger. Then it pointed to itself, to the healing leg that now bore weight with only slight favoring. Me, go soon. Others, find me. Others. Not find. You. It wants to leave, Pat translated unnecessarily. It's saying it can travel now, that it needs to intercept its people before they reach us. She looked at Marcus. The leg isn't fully healed. Another 2 weeks would be better, would ensure no re-injury. But Marcus, if those others find this facility, we become the enemy, he finished. We become the threat that took their family member, and any possibility of peaceful interaction dies. Sarah pulled up topographic maps on her tablet. If we release it here, it's 8 miles of rough terrain to reach the last camera location, through undergrowth, across elevation change, with an incompletely healed femur. The risk of re-injury is significant. But the risk of interception is worse, Marcus said, the calculation brutal but clear. We've just spent 2 weeks teaching it that we're trustworthy, and now we're going to demonstrate that trust by letting it go before it's fully healed, into a wilderness where its people are actively searching, possibly panicked. He looked at Kran, who watched them with that terrible perceptiveness, understanding that decisions were being made. Pat, ask it if it can find them. Ask if it knows where they'd be. The exchange took 5 minutes, complicated by the need for concepts they'd only partially mapped, but Kran's answer was clear. Yes, it knew the patterns, the logic of the search. It could intercept, could signal, could reunite. But, And here it made a new sign, a gesture of something crumbling between its fingers. It would need to leave immediately. The window was closing. "There's still the young one," Pat said quietly. "The injured juvenile it told us about. It hasn't stopped asking, Marcus. Every day, some variation of the same request. Others need help. Young one broken. You help?" Kran heard its signs echoed in Pat's voice, stepped closer to the barrier. It began a sequence they'd come to recognize, formal, structured, like a prepared statement. Others live, hidden, many seasons. The sign for seasons was a cycle, a full rotation, their closest analog to years. Humans everywhere, houses, roads, noise. Others, less space, less food, less safe. It paused, ensuring they were following, then continued. "Young one, hurt, 2 seasons ago, leg break. It touched its own healing femur. Not same, bone, grow wrong, now walk, slow, weak, cannot climb, cannot run, cannot..." It made a sign they hadn't taught, a gesture of distance and independence, then tried to rephrase, "cannot leave danger." The picture came clear. A malunion, a fracture that had healed improperly, leaving the young one disabled in a context where mobility was survival. In a human child, it would mean surgery, re-breaking the bone, setting it correctly. In a hidden people living without medical infrastructure, it meant progressive limitation, vulnerability, potentially death if the group needed to relocate quickly or flee a threat. "It wants us to fix the juvenile's leg," Sarah said, her voice hollow. "It's asking for surgical intervention on an individual we've never met, from a species that's undocumented, requiring anesthesia and post-operative care and follow-up that would mean, what? Keeping a young one here for weeks? Months? Making contact with its family group to coordinate care? Exposing them," Marcus finished. "The cost of helping is exposure. The cost of exposure is the end of their hidden existence. We're not just being asked to perform surgery. We're being asked to be the catalyst for the end of a way of life." Kran watched them, saw the resistance, the impossibility, and something in its expression changed. It sat down slowly, careful of its leg, and picked up the charcoal and paper. What it drew this time was different, a timeline visualized as a sequence of images. First, many figures, a large population, then fewer still. The final image showed only a small cluster, 8, maybe 10 individuals, with the young injured one marked distinctly. It tapped this final group, signed, "Now, others, now." Then it drew what looked like a broken branch, splitting further, fragmenting. It pointed to this image, signed, "Soon, others, soon." "It's showing us population decline," Pat said, her voice shaking. "It's saying they're dying out, and that the trajectory is toward extinction." She watched as Kran added one more detail, a small sketch of the young one, with the malformed leg marked in exaggerated brokenness. Then a line from that figure to an X, a universal symbol for termination. And that the disabled juvenile is at the highest risk. "Marcus, it's not just asking us to help one injured child, it's asking us to intervene in a species-level extinction event." The magnitude of it was paralyzing. They were 3 scientists in an off-grid wildlife center, operating outside institutional oversight, possessing knowledge that would rewrite anthropology and biology textbooks if released. And they were being asked to make a decision that should require ethics boards, governmental consultation, international coordination, the machinery of formal decision-making that existed specifically to prevent unilateral action in scenarios this consequential. But that machinery would also mean exposure. It would mean Kran and its people becoming subjects of study, conservation targets, political footballs. It would mean the end of autonomy, the imposition of human frameworks on a people who had successfully avoided those frameworks for 500,000 years. "What do you want to do?" Marcus asked, directing the question not at his colleagues, but at Kran, whose people these were, whose authority was greater than any academic credential. Kran's response was immediate. It stood, positioned itself at the barrier with the formality of ceremony, and began a sequence of signs that had the rhythm of something rehearsed, perhaps something prepared over the many hours of solitude, the long nights of healing. Others, live free, always. Humans, not know, not see, not capture. It made a sign they'd taught for choice, a branching path. Better, live hidden, less years, more free. Then it made the alternative. Live known, maybe more years, not free. The sign for not free was hands bound, caged, imprisoned. It stopped, made eye contact with each of them in turn, a profoundly human gesture of ensuring attention, and continued. Young one, need help, need. Walk strong, need. Live full, not need. Be caged. The dilemma crystallized. To help the juvenile meant some degree of contact, some level of exposure. But Cran was drawing a boundary. Help could be given, intervention could be accepted, but only if it didn't cost the fundamental freedom that defined its people's existence. What are you proposing? Pat signed. How can we help without exposing your people? Cran picked up the charcoal again. This time it drew a different map, the facility, marked clearly. A path leading away, a location marked with an X deep in the forest network. It's signed, me, go, find others, bring young one, here. It circled the forest location, not the facility. You, come, help, there, not here. Then it made a new sign, emphatic. You, see, young one, only. Not see others, others, not see you. A blind exchange, Marcus breathed. It's proposing that we treat the juvenile at a neutral site. It brings the patient, we provide care, but we don't make contact with the main group. They stay hidden, we help the one, and everyone maintains separation. That's impossible, Sarah objected. Surgical intervention requires sterile environment, anesthesia monitoring, post-op observation. We can't just do orthopedic surgery in a forest clearing. We can, if we bring the equipment, Pat countered, her mind already problem-solving. Portable surgical setup, battery-powered monitors, a tent structure that's cleanable, it's field medicine, combat surgery protocols, difficult but not impossible. Illegal, Sarah snapped. Unlicensed, uninsured, performing surgery on an unidentified species without institutional oversight or emergency backup. If anything goes wrong, infection, anesthesia complications, unanticipated anatomy, we have no support, no liability protection, nothing. And if we don't, Marcus challenged, we let a child die of preventable disability because the paperwork is too complicated. The room fell silent, except for the hum of equipment and the distant drip of snowmelt from the eaves. Through the plexiglass, Cran waited, watching them debate a choice it had already made, had probably made the moment it woke up in this strange room and decided to trust the beings who had saved its life. Cran, Marcus signed, pulling the individual's attention. If we do this, if we help the young one, what happens after? Does your people stay hidden? Do we see each other again? The individual's response was slow, weighted with emotion that transcended species. You see me. Last time. Now, it gestured around the room, the space of their 2 weeks of communication and careful trust-building. Others, not see you, not ever. Better. Others, safe. Then it made a gesture that looked like closing a door. Finality. Me. Remember. You. Remember. Story. Not more. It's saying this is farewell, Pat translated, though Marcus had understood, that after we help the juvenile, if we help the juvenile, the connection ends. We go back to our world. They stay in theirs, and all we have is memory. Cran wasn't finished. It signed with careful emphasis. Young one. Live. Full. Maybe have young ones. More. Continue. It made the sign for many, many that indicated vast time, generations. Others continue, hidden, free, because you help, you not tell. The covenant was explicit now. Intervention in exchange for permanent silence. They would be guardians of a secret that could never be shared, witnesses to a people who would return to invisibility, carrying knowledge that would die with them. The scientific discovery of the century, the anthropological find that would rewrite human origins, and they would have to bury it. Marcus thought of his career, the tenure-track position that depended on publications, the expectations of productivity and peer-reviewed output. He thought of Sarah's conservation work, Pat's primate cognition research, the professional identities they'd built over decades. All of it predicated on sharing knowledge, on contributing to the collective scientific enterprise. And then he looked at Kran, who had trusted them with its life, with its people's existence, who was asking not for glory or recognition, but for silence and help in equal measure. "We do it," he said. "We help the young one. We maintain the secret. And then we let them disappear." Pat nodded, tears tracking down her face. "We do it." Sarah took longer, the weight of pragmatic responsibility heavy on her shoulders. "Then, we do it, but we do it right. Full surgical protocol, sterile field, the best equipment we can access. If we're going to risk everything, we're going to give that child the best possible chance." Kran's shoulders dropped, the visible release of tension it had carried since the moment it learned to ask for help. It placed both hands over its heart, then extended them outward, palms up, the gesture it had invented to mean please, but now transformed into gratitude, into recognition of gift given. Then it signed, with the simplicity of fundamental truth. "You, good humans." The release happened at dawn, on day 17. They'd spent 36 hours preparing, smuggling surgical equipment from Sarah's university contacts, assembling sterile packs, planning a supply cache that Kran could guide them to when the time came. They'd expanded Kran's vocabulary to include medical terms, taught it signs for sleep, anesthesia, clean, sterilization, pain medicine, and crucially, trust and permission. Quran would return to its people, explain what had happened, negotiate consent from the juvenile's family, and guide the young one to a specified location, a box canyon 8 miles northeast, accessible but remote, with water source and enough flat ground for a surgical tent. If the family agreed, Kran would mark the location with stacked stones in a specific pattern. Sarah would monitor via drone, and when the signal appeared, they'd move in with equipment. The goodbye happened through plexiglass. Kran had refused to leave the secured area until the last moment, insisting on one final exchange of signs, a completion of the vocabulary they'd built. "You teach." Many words, it signed to Pat. "Now, me, teach." One word. It made a complex gesture. Hand over heart, moving outward in a spiral, then coming to rest with palm down. Protective. It repeated this 3 times, ensuring they memorized the movement, then pointed to them, to itself, to the space between. "What does it mean?" Pat asked, signing the question. Kran's answer was in 3 parts. Remember, protect, continue. The one sign encompassing all 3 concepts, the gesture meaning guardianship of memory, or perhaps the duty to hold and shield what is sacred. It's giving us a word from its language, Pat realized, a concept that doesn't exist in English. The responsibility of bearing witness without betrayal. She pressed her hand to the plexiglass, matched by Kran's massive palm on the other side. "We will remember. We will protect. We will keep the covenant." They removed the plexiglass barrier. Marcus led Kran through the facility to the exterior door, moving slowly to accommodate the still healing leg. The individual paused at the threshold, looked back at the 3 humans who had saved its life and learned its language, and made one final sign. "Thank you, friends." Then it stepped into the grey November dawn and was gone, moving into the forest, with a fluid silence that made Marcus understand how a species could remain hidden for half a millennium. Within 20 steps, it was invisible, swallowed by the Douglas firs and the morning mist. Sarah launched the drone on day 19. The box canyon was empty, no signal. Day 20, the same. On day 21, Marcus was beginning to think the family had rejected the risk of contact, when Sarah's laptop chirped with aerial footage. 3 stacked stones, arranged in the pyramidal structure Kran had specified. "They're there," Sarah whispered. "Or they will be. We have to go now." The hike in was brutal, with 60 pounds of equipment each. They moved in silence, communicating only through hand signals, approaching the canyon with the wariness of negotiators entering a hostage situation. Because that's what this was, Marcus realized. A negotiation where both parties had everything to lose, where trust was the only currency and betrayal would echo through generations. The box canyon opened before them, a natural amphitheater of stone and ancient cedars. And there, in the center, a small figure sat on a fallen log. The juvenile was tiny compared to Kran, maybe 4.5 feet tall, covered in lighter brown hair with a distinctive reddish cast. The face was rounder, less developed in the brow ridge, the eyes enormous and dark, and the right leg, even from a distance, showed the telltale signature of Malunian, a shortening, an angular deformity where the femur had healed at an incorrect angle. Kran sat beside the young one massive arm around the small shoulders in a gesture of universal comfort. When the humans entered the clearing, Kran stood, signed a greeting, then signed to the juvenile. Teaching, translating, bridging worlds, the young one watched them with naked fear and wonder. Kran signed something complex, and the juvenile slowly raised one small hand, mimicked the sign for hello that Pat had taught weeks ago. Marcus felt something break open in his chest. This was a child, barely adolescent, maybe 12 or 13 in human equivalent years. Disabled, vulnerable, dependent on adults to negotiate a salvation it couldn't fully understand. And it was trusting them, because Kran had told it to trust. "We're going to help you," Pat signed, knowing the juvenile probably didn't understand yet, but needing to say it. "We're going to make you strong." They worked for 6 hours, setting up the surgical tent, establishing the sterile field, running through protocols with the intensity of physicians preparing for combat surgery. Kran helped, following instructions, translating when the juvenile showed fear, maintaining the fragile bridge of communication. The surgery itself was brutal in its technical complexity. The juvenile's anatomy was close enough to human to use standard orthopedic approaches, but different enough to require constant adjustment. The femur had healed with 20 degrees of varus angulation and significant shortening. Marcus performed the osteotomy, cutting through the incorrectly healed bone, while Sarah managed anesthesia, monitoring vitals on portable equipment, adjusting gas flow by hand. Pat assisted, retractors and suction, the 3 of them functioning as a unit born of desperation and shared purpose. Kran sat outside the tent, visible through the transparent surgical drape, maintaining vigil. Once when the juvenile's blood pressure dropped and alarms sounded, Kran stood abruptly, and Marcus saw in that motion the potential for violence, the primal protective instinct that could erupt if this child died under their hands. But the crisis passed. They realigned the femur, secured it with biodegradable pins and an external fixator that would allow adjustment as healing progressed, closed the incision with meticulous care. 6 hours and 47 minutes after the first cut, the juvenile was breathing steadily, vitals stable, the malformed leg now straight and properly aligned. "It worked," Sarah breathed, disbelief and exhaustion making her voice shake. "God help us! It actually worked!" They kept the juvenile sedated for 12 hours, monitoring in shifts, while Kran maintained its vigil. Marcus tried to imagine what this act of trust cost, allowing unconsciousness of a group member in the presence of another species, relinquishing control so completely. It spoke to desperation, yes, but also to something more. The decision that survival trumped isolation, that accepting help was worth the risk of exposure. When the juvenile woke, groggy but alert, Kran was there immediately, signing reassurance, showing that the leg was whole, explaining that pain would come, but healing would follow. The young one looked at the external fixator with obvious fear, but Kran's calm translated. This was temporary, this was treatment, this was the price of walking whole again. Pat taught them both how to care for the surgical site, how to identify signs of infection, how to adjust the fixator as healing progressed. She drew diagrams, demonstrated with gestures, made Kran repeat back the instructions until she was satisfied. They left antibiotics, pain medication measured for estimated body mass, and sterile supplies for dressing changes. And then came the moment Marcus had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. The juvenile signed with Kran's coaching. "Thank you." Then it made that complex gesture Kran had taught them, the word for remember, protect, continue, and Marcus understood that this child had been given the same covenant, had been taught that this encounter must be held sacred and secret. "You're welcome," he signed back. "Heal strong, live full." Kran lifted the juvenile carefully. The small one couldn't walk yet, wouldn't for weeks, and prepared to leave. Then it turned back, made one final sign to Marcus specifically. "You, good humans, rare. Most, not like you." "I know," Marcus signed, the weight of human history heavy on his shoulders. "Your people are right to hide, but know that some of us would help, if we could. Some of us would protect." Kran's expression, Marcus would remember it for the rest of his life, held sadness and acceptance and a strange, weary wisdom. It signed, "Maybe, other time, other world, not this world." Then a pause, and the final message. "My people have story, now, about good humans. About you, story, will continue. Long, long time, you, not forgotten." And then they were gone. Kran carrying the juvenile into the forest, moving with that preternatural silence despite the burden. Marcus watched until they disappeared into the cedar shadows, becoming myth, becoming memory, becoming story. The cleanup took 4 hours. They left no trace, burning contaminated materials in a portable incinerator, packing out every scrap of equipment, erasing their presence from the canyon. The external fixator would biodegrade in 6 months. The pins would integrate or be naturally expelled. In a year, there would be no physical evidence that 3 humans had performed surgery on a being that shouldn't exist. They hiked out in darkness, guided by headlamps, too exhausted for speech. Back at the facility, they began the process of erasure, deleting files, destroying genetic samples, wiping hard drives with military-grade software. The drawings Kran had made, they burned, keeping only photographs stored on encrypted drives, hidden in password-protected archives. Dr. Chen's genomic analysis was scrubbed from the server, the raw data corrupted beyond recovery. "We're destroying everything," Pat said, watching decades of potential research turn to ash. "We're erasing proof of the most significant anthropological discovery in human history." "We're keeping a promise," Marcus corrected. "We're being the good humans Kran believed we could be." 3 weeks later, Sarah's wildlife cameras caught one final image. A figure in the distance, walking upright through a clearing, moving with the confidence of an uninjured individual. Beside it, smaller but keeping pace, a juvenile with a pronounced but functional gait. They were heading north, deeper into the wilderness, toward territories where human presence thinned to nothing. Marcus stared at the image for a long time, then deleted it. Dr. Marcus Webb published nothing about his winter in the Cascades. His tenure committee, reviewing his application, noted the absence of productivity, the gap in his publication record. They denied tenure. He left academia 6 months later, took a position with a small wildlife conservation non-profit, and spent the next 3 decades working in remote areas, protecting habitat, ensuring corridors remained intact. He never told anyone what he'd seen, but in the silence of forests, in the mystery of unidentified tracks, in the occasional glimpse of something that moved like a person but melted into shadow, he felt the weight of the covenant. Remember, protect, continue. Some knowledge is not meant to be shared. Some discoveries serve best as guardianship, as the silent work of ensuring that what is hidden remains safe. The scientific method demands replication, verification, the building of collective understanding. But some truths are singular, unrepeatable, held sacred by the few who witness them. Trans people survived, Marcus believed, or he chose to believe, which amounted to the same thing. Somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, a small population endured, carrying their own stories, teaching their young, maintaining the careful balance of existence without exposure. And one of those stories, passed from one generation to the next, told of a time when one of their own was injured, was saved by unlikely allies, when a young one was healed by strangers who asked nothing in return except silence. The story ended, Marcus imagined, with a teaching that even among humans, even in the species that had claimed the world, there were some, rare but real, who could be trusted. Some who understood that not all gifts required acknowledgement, that not all debts required repayment, that sometimes the greatest service was the act of witnessing, and then, with care and purpose, choosing to forget. In his 70s, Marcus returned to the Box Canyon one final time. It was spring, the cedars heavy with new growth, water running clear over ancient stone. He sat in the place where he'd once performed surgery on a being the world would never know existed, and he spoke aloud the covenant one final time. I remember, I protect, I continue. Your people are safe in my silence. The forest answered with the wind, with the call of a thrush, with the eternal indifference of nature to human concerns. But Marcus felt, in the way one feels truth without evidence, that somewhere in the green cathedral of Douglas firs and old-growth cedar, someone heard, someone knew, and that was enough. If this story moved you, if you felt the weight of impossible choices and the beauty of trust across species, please share it with others who appreciate thoughtful, speculative fiction. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that blend scientific rigor with deep emotional resonance. Tales that ask not just what if, but what should we do? Let's keep the conversation going about ethics, discovery, and the cost of witness. Your support helps us continue crafting narratives that honor both wonder and responsibility.